The king of the Jews? Well, I'm the one wearing the crown, you know, and I worked hard to get this. Sacrifices were made. Not by me, of course, but the people put their faith in me. Well, actually, Rome puts its faith in me, but the people follow me if they know what's good for them. So, what is all of this prophetic nonsense about a child being born who will be the shepherd for the people of Israel? That's my job. I'm shepherding my people just fine, thank you, with no help from you, I might add. Of course, there will always be those who say I'm not worthy, not being born a Jew. It's a big deal. The troublemakers, malcontents, and now I've got 3 crazy men outside stirring up the malcontents, telling them that they've come all the way from the east, following a star, for crying out loud, a star! Searching for some infant king who thinks he can take over my throne. It's crazy, right? I mean, these guys are lunatics. Astrologers. But the thing is, what if the people actually believe them? What if they actually believe that there's a child somewhere in my lands who is the Son of God himself? That could be anarchy. The people could rise up. They could stop doing whatever they've been doing. Just leave everything and go follow a star? Well, who would plant the corn? Who would build me my temple? Who would be there to pay me my taxes? No, 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 no! This cannot be, I tell you, everything would change. I cannot allow this birth in Bethlehem to go unanswered. As long as this child lives, I am not safe. You, chief priest. You, chief priest. Go and find these 3 wise men and ask them to seek out this child born in Bethlehem. And when they find him, send me word so that I may go and pay my homage. Oh, that will be all.
That was our Youth and Family Ministry Director, Brandon Nagel. He is multi-talented, and that was under the direction of our new Director of Worship and Volunteers, Jan Chapman. What a great staff we have. Yes, good job. So we are continuing our series called Discovering the Christ Within You. And we are following the 3 wise men on their trek. And last week we talked about how the wise men represent wisdom in you and me, and how we've got lots that we can learn from them. And I want to share with you just a little bit about something that came to me in an email this last week. You see, we really stressed last Sunday about how the Christ love is in everyone. And that's what we're about. We're about, in this series, rediscovering the Christ in you, remembering it, reawakening to it. It's not being born in you, it's always been there. So it's about rediscovering it. And one of our congregants wrote me an email and gave me permission to share it. She said that last week's service brought her to tears. She said, "For me, there were many reasons for tears yesterday. They began when you said early in the service, we don't have to look and search for the Christ light out there or up there somewhere, because the Christ light lives within each of us." She writes, I so love to hear that. I know it is so, and I live with that reality, but I did not always. And maybe that's true for some of you. Maybe for some of you, you're still coming to know that the Christ is in you. She says, before unity, I had moments when I felt connected to Spirit, but many more when I did not, and I longed for it. Not believing, knowing that Spirit is alive right inside me. This knowing, this holy gift, changed me and my life. So, in these weeks that lead up to Christmas, pardon me, we're about reclaiming the truth that has always been the truth of you. And we're following the wise men on that trek. Now, last week I promised you that I would tell you a good old corny wise man joke every week. And I asked you to help me out. Some of you gave me jokes that I cannot share from the pulpit. That's not any help, but I did laugh. But I want to share with you a story, another version of the three wise men. It seemed that they had been traveling so long that they were just literally exhausted. I mean, by the time they got to Bethlehem and found where the manger was, right underneath that beautiful star, they were exhausted. But they were there prepared to kneel down and pay homage to the Christ child. So one of the wise men, as he knelt down, hit his head right on the wood that was the manger where the baby was. And right as he hit his head, he said, "Jesus Christ!" To which Mary responded, "You know, Joseph, I think I like that name better than Harold." So a joke is only as good as the number of groans that I get. There we go. That's what I was looking for. I've got one more to tell you. I need one more, so keep them coming. Alrighty, so here we go. Today we're talking about King Herod, because before the wise men made it all the way to Bethlehem, they first stopped off to see King Herod. And what we read in the book of Matthew, and by the way, this story is only told in the book of Matthew, chapter 2, we read that after they had visited King Herod, when King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it has been written by the prophet. And then the story goes on. Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." And when they had heard the king, they set out. Now, what we find out later is that King Herod is really being very sneaky about all of this. He hasn't the slightest intention of paying homage, which means tribute and honor, to the baby. He actually goes on eventually because he doesn't find the child himself, he goes on to decree that all infant boys under the age of 2 be killed. He is that afraid, he is that threatened by the fact that some child might grow up and become the king, might take away his authority. Now, the interesting thing is that Herod was not actually a king, though he considered himself to be. He was a governor of the area, and he was accountable to Caesar. But he was ruthless in his approach. Anyone that got in his way could suffer dire consequences. And so what we hear from the story is that Herod was angry. What you got to see today was that Herod was angry. Angry because he was threatened. Now, the beautiful thing about the Bible is that not only are the stories in them rich with meaning about what happened in the past, but they carry on their greatest meaning when you and I look at what they represent in us today. Every figure, every person, every place in the Bible represents some aspect of your or my consciousness. Even Herod. I mean, it's easy for us to see that, well, there's the Christ child, and that represents love. That represents the love in you and me. But what does Herod represent in you and me? Bingo. You get the prize for today, Missy. She said ego. Herod represents our ego. And I want to talk to you a little bit about ego today. Not ego as in a healthy ego, like I've got self-confidence and I'm going to accomplish something, but the kind of ego that refuses to allow you to accept the love. The kind of ego that results in the tantrums that you saw from our King Herod earlier. You see, the ego has a very important job for you and me. And the ego's job is to preserve our identity. All of it. The good and the bad. The ego's job is to absolutely preserve all of who you are because the ego is afraid of losing control. And it's ironic because you would think that with all the love out there in the world, why wouldn't we just take it in? Why would the ego part of us ever reject love from coming in? But the ego is so fearful of change, so fearful of losing its own identity that even love becomes a threat to it. Even the Christ child was a threat to Herod. And so the ego voice is the voice in you that well, let me give you an example. Think of a child. Think of a little toddler boy who's taken his trucks and his toys and he's out in the middle of the dirt and he's playing, he's getting muddy and he's playing with his trucks and another child comes up and goes to take one of his trucks. What does he do? He says, "That's mine. That's mine. These trucks are mine. This dirt is mine. This space is mine. It's all mine." And early on, we learn to define what is ours and what is not ours. And as we grow, we continue to keep with us everything that we've ever claimed that was ours. It's part of our identity, the good and the bad. So, all the things that we accumulate in life, our cars, our houses, they become part of our identity. The jobs we have, they become part of our identity. The wounds that we have from the past, they become part of our identity. The bad things that people have said to us, they become part of our identity. It all becomes part of who we are. And it's an odd thing because even the bad, if you will, and I'm going to put quotes around bad, even the stuff that makes us uncomfortable is part of who we are. And we would rather keep it whole than change. And it's just like you saw Herod over here stomping like a toddler, right? Stomping like a toddler at the thought that anything could threaten his rule. Well, the ego wants to rule. The ego wants to rule you and me. It wants to rule our thoughts. It wants to keep us separate. Above all else, it wants to keep us separate. In fact, there's an acronym for ego, EGO, edging God out. Because the ego's even threatened by God in that to give in surrender to God threatens the identity of the ego. But here's the thing. The love of the Christ is stronger than the ego. The love of the Christ is stronger than the ego. And so what do you do about this ego? What do you do about this ego that tries to keep you separate, that operates from fear? It primarily operates from fear in the world, in absolute opposition to the love of the Christ. Well, Eckhart Tolle, the great spiritual writer who wrote The Power of Now and who wrote A New Earth, says that the way to deal with the ego is simply to notice it. So when you hear the ego voice looks like whenever you feel a need to be right, or whenever you need to blame somebody else, or whenever it is that you've wandered off into should land, where you're saying, well, I should have done this, or I shouldn't have done that, or I should this. You know, those are all the voices of the ego, right? That are trying to protect your identity. Whenever you hear the voice of that ego, which is often kind of a victimizing voice, ironically enough, whenever you hear that voice, what Tolle says is you just notice it. Like the 2-year-old child. You know what the 2-year-old child really ultimately wants when they throw a tantrum is attention. So if you make a commitment to just notice that ego voice that's coming up in you, it begins to quiet, just like the child having a tantrum. And the other thing about the ego voice to know is that when you notice it, ask yourself, who's doing the noticing? It's the divine in you that's doing the noticing. It's the Christ in you. It's the higher self of you that notices this ego voice. And so it's a good thing when you notice that that voice is out there active. When you notice it, you're noticing from a higher place. You're noticing from a deeper place of wisdom in you. So it's actually a good thing. So Herod represents the ego, and actually, he's really an archetype. An archetype means a figure or a story that is really part of our collective consciousness out there, that's part of the consciousness. And so, if Herod is an archetype, let me bring you closer to bring you to an archetype that's closer to home, but is very similar. And that's Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge. Now, how many of you have ever either read or seen A Christmas Carol? Raise your hand. Yeah, most of you in the room have either seen it, read it, or you've heard of Ebenezer Scrooge. He is an archetype for our culture because Scrooge's issue was that he was miserly and he hoarded money. That's how it was that his ego protected him. He hoarded money. He worked nonstop. That was another way of protecting himself. In fact, he was such a ruthless boss that he didn't even want to give Bob Cratchit the day off for Christmas. He finally relented and did that, but he'd been invited over for dinner at his nephew's and he refused that. Bah humbug was all that he could say, right? He couldn't take in the love. There was love wanting to come to him all over the place, but he couldn't take it in. He'd protected and covered up his heart. And that's what happens with the wounds of our lives. You see, what you find out in the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, as the different angels come to appear to him, and the first angel is the angel of his past and shows him what his life was like. And you see a glimmer of happiness there, but then you see the pains that happened to him. He had a very wounded childhood. And then his beloved sister dies in childbirth, giving birth to his nephew, whose house he won't go to. His good friend and partner died 7 years ago on Christmas Eve. So he's got a lot of baggage. We all have a lot of baggage. We all have a lot of wounds, right? And what the ego does is it chooses to keep those and hoard those. It's part of our identity. We don't want to let go of those wounds, even the stories that are painful, because they're part of who we are. We don't want to let the love in, because the love will destroy who we are. See how that works? So the Scrooge character is another archetype. It's another archetype of someone who can't let the love in. And when the angel of the present comes to Scrooge and shows him how it is that Bob Cratchit's family is having a love-filled Christmas, you know, there's that glimpse right into their home, which is full of light and candles and warmth. And even though they don't have 2 nickels to rub together because Ebenezer Scrooge pays so little to Bob Cratchit, he has such a small salary, and yet in their home is love. And it mystifies Scrooge. He can't quite understand it. How can they be so happy when one of their children has a disability and they have no money? How can they be so happy? He's mystified by it. But as the night unfolds, and you know the story, eventually he decides to let the love in. And the love transforms him. The love is stronger than the ego. The love is stronger than his egoic needs to keep all that he's been lugging around with him. And you know, at Christmas time, there's a lot of opportunity to notice that King Herod voice in us. But here's what I want you to do. When you notice that ego voice, I want you to just get a little attitude and just kind of notice it and then say, you know what? That's just King Harry up to his old tricks again. You can give it a name if you want to, and that makes it even easier to dialogue with. It's less threatening then. It's like, oh man, why did I think that? Why did I say that? Oh, I know why. That's King Harry coming out to speak again. You see, this voice of the ego is threatened by change. It's threatened whenever someone that we love leaves us. This voice of the ego is always in fear. But you remember what's said in the book of 1 John? It says, perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love casts out fear. And that doesn't mean that you have to love perfectly. It just means that you have the divine love in you. And as you shine that love, as you allow that love in, it casts out the fear. And Course in Miracles puts it this way. Course in Miracles says, every action is either a statement of love or a call for love. I remember the first time I heard that. It just resonated with me so deeply that every action or everything a person says or does is either a statement of love or it's a call for love. This King Herod is calling for love. Scrooge was calling for love. In its own way, our ego is calling for love, but it's too fearful to let the love in. In his book, A Deep Breath of Life, Alan Cohen is a great spiritual writer, and he leads workshops and such. Many of them are targeted on relationships and helping people be able to really accept and experience love in their lives. And he said that one of the things that used to mystify him is that in the middle of a 5-day workshop on love and relationships, round about day 3, things would start to get kind of crazy, he said. He said that the participants would start to feel afraid and angry, jealous, small, and withdrawn. And he couldn't figure that out because here he was teaching about love, right? And yet this other stuff was showing up. But then he finally got it. That in the field of such love, the other stuff comes out to be released. He said, fear arises because it can be healed in such an environment. Every person on the planet carries a hidden pool of pain and grief. We all do. As young children, we were taught very methodically to stuff our pain and sadness, to accommodate those around us who could not deal with it. We went on with our lives being unhappy, but not knowing exactly why. And then when we enter into an intimate relationship, open up to a trustworthy counselor, attend a quality seminar, and these are my words now, or even just come into a loving spiritual community like this. When those things happen, he says, the buried sewage comes rushing to the surface. And then he says, this is wonderful. The soul knows that for the first time in a very long time, it is safe to look at these issues, process them, and heal them so we can get on with enjoying the love that is available. Perfect love casts out fear. That's what the Christmas season is all about. It's a time to remember the love in you that is stronger than the fear of whatever's facing you right now. It's a time to rediscover the love in you that is strong enough to heal any wound that you have. A time to reawaken to the field of love that is all around you. It's the time to let love in and to let love out. Would you repeat after me? I let go fear.
I let go fear.
And I let in love.
And I let in love.
I let go fear.
I let go fear.
And I let out love.
And I let out love.
I let go fear.
I let go fear.
And I am love.
And I am love.
God bless you.